Public safety versus the public right to know in the death of Daniel Prude at the hands of Rochester police. I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Bill, there's recently been a release of documents related to the March death of Daniel Prude, who died about a week after he was taken into police custody. This is the famous case of the man who appears in video naked, strung out on PCP, threatening police by spitting on them and saying that he had coronavirus. They eventually put a spit bag over his head, and a police officer, in the process of kneeling on the suspect to restrain him, county medical examiner said he died of asphyxia. But that's not really the question here, Bill. This is another one of those cases that sounds a lot like the George Floyd case. The real question here is the cover-up that apparently happened behind the scenes, not in the kind of way that you think of cover-ups being something nefarious, but it was almost as if the police officers seemed to be saying, well, we don't want this to be misinterpreted, so let's not let the family's attorney, for example, have the body cam video, and they strung him out for 4 months before that was released. It looks like they did a number of things in the police department, according to internal memos, designed basically to keep Rochester from blowing up. And yet now the accusation is that it was a cover-up to protect their own skins and not in the interest of justice. Bill, how do police wrestle with something like this when they have information that they suspect or know would be inflammatory? Should they release it immediately? Should they withhold it for the public safety? What do you think?
Just yesterday shot an episode on Boeing, and I said that I don't blame people for not knowing what they don't know when they don't know it, but cover-ups and things of that nature are entirely different animals. And that seemed to be the knee-jerk reaction to this, would be that they had no business covering this up. But it does raise an interesting question. It really does. The first thing that comes to my mind on this is that there was a time in the country back when I was a boy and we were, going to school and writing on tree barks with sharp stones. But there was a time in this country when the press was responsible enough, and even individual attorneys were responsible enough to understand that there are some things that don't need to be kept secret for the sake of secret, but things that at the very least can wait. If you had the details of the D-Day invasion in 1944 and you were the New York Times, you could either run the story the day before the invasion or you could sit on it. And in 1944, they would have sat on it because they would have understood that the public need to know is greatly outweighed by the fact that they can know later. Right now, it's going to get people killed. So there is a case to be made for this kind of thing. This was this before the Floyd?
Yeah, well, the incident actually happened before the Floyd situation did back in March, and then Floyd was in May.
That's right.
But the memos really started flying after the fact because there wasn't a lot of coverage of the death of Daniel Prude at the time that it happened. And then the concern among officers within the force grew as the George Floyd thing began to happen. And Bill, by the way, your D-Day analogy, while interesting, presumes that everybody agrees on who the good guys are.
Well, I don't know how many Nazis there were on the New York Times editorial board, but I do know how many communists there were. Okay, so obviously, this has got a little more nuance than, hey, they covered it up. If they've got a situation where they look and they see American streets on fire and everything burning, and especially they see the media adding as much fuel to this fire as they possibly could, and we know they added fuel to the fire because when we had that shooting in Wisconsin, it was not on the news 24/7 as the George Floyd thing was. So now you've got a situation where you've got a police department that is basically saying, look, the country is burning down because of people's issues towards police. We didn't do anything wrong here. But this is the kind of thing that, again, look, let me come back to something. We did that episode on the defense of the police officer in the George Floyd case. And there was a lot of information there that I just plain didn't know beforehand. I just didn't know. A lot of exculpatory information. And the problem with 24/7 news coverage is that there is never a discussion of the kind of nuances that we're talking about here. We never heard during the George Floyd thing that Floyd was saying, "I can't breathe," before he was on the ground. If people had heard that, if the news had reported that George Floyd was walking the streets going up to policemen saying, "I can't breathe," then that story would have been completely different. And it turns out that's what actually happened. And so you can hardly blame the police for living in an environment where the news media does not do the job that they're supposed to do, which is to provide all of the news. They don't have to interpret it for us. They just have to provide all of it. If they were to say, "Hey, this guy was choking and spitting on the policeman, and he said he had COVID-19, which means it essentially is assault with a deadly weapon. So they put a spit thing over him, and then the guy died." Okay, that would have been a rational presentation of what actually happened. But that's not what would have happened. They just would have shown the body cam of the guy on the ground. There wouldn't have been any explanation, wouldn't have been nothing. And so it's hard to fault the police department in a case like this. And at the same time, you cannot expect the truth to stay buried in the information age.
Here's an email, by the way, from the Deputy Rochester Police Chief to his boss, the chief. And I'm quoting here, and this is from a New York Times report drawing on these documents that were recently released, a mass of city documents that were released Monday of this week as we record this. Here it is, the quote, "We certainly do not want people to misinterpret the officer's actions and conflate this incident with any recent killings of unarmed black men by law enforcement nationally. That would simply be a false narrative and could create animosity and potentially violent blowback in this community as a result." You read that, and it almost makes it sound like he's trying to save lives.
This is precisely the point I was about to get to, and that is, it's one thing to say, well, the police department's just covering its butt. But as a general rule, if you look at what happened with George Floyd, they did burn down a police precinct, but most of the damage and the burnings and the people that lost their entire life savings and people that put their entire lives into a restaurant or so on, the buildings that burned down had nothing to do with the police. If the job of the police is to protect public safety and property, then you can make an extremely compelling case that this was the right thing to do at the time. If it had been me, I don't know what again, I never really know the details of most of these things. I happen to know a bit about the Boeing thing that we talked about last time. But it seems to me that in a case like this, what you would want to do is you would want to take that information as soon as it happens, right at the time of the event, and take it to some trusted third party, like a judge, and present it to a judge so that you are cleared of the
appearance of any kind of a cover-up.
That's right. That's right. And you therefore then basically get what you're looking for, which is the best possible outcome, safest possible outcome. And you also demonstrate that you're not interested, you're not trying to obstruct justice here. You're trying to basically delay the release of information that is being turned into, as we call it, rocket fuel, and not pour more rocket fuel on a country that's already burning down. Now, I can tell you how all of this stuff would work in a world that I would like to live in, and that used to be much closer to the one that we live in now. It wasn't a perfect world by any means, but in a world where in America where sanity was still had a say in things, you would find that the George Floyd thing would cause outrage and protests, appropriately so, for people who saw it and so on. There would be a report on why it would happen, and then people would still say, well, this is just evidence of other brutality or not, or whatever. They would have gotten the whole story. But, and this is the big but, if Giuliani had been mayor of Los Angeles and all these other cities that burned down, what he would have done is what he did in New York. He would have said, if you're protesting this act of what you perceive to be police brutality, you go right ahead. The second you throw a rock or a stone at a policeman or burn down a building or smash a window, you're going to jail. That's not a protest. If he had done that, if he had been allowed to do that, which he'd done 3 or 4 times in the history of New York, and which we saw again a couple times recently, where they go in there and aggressively go after the people, not who are protesting, the people who are using the protest to steal things. When you go after those people, these riots don't happen. And if those riots didn't happen, then there'd be no reason for the police force to have made this delay. But that's not what happens. That's not the world we live in anymore.
So the mayor, of Rochester, Lovely Warren, has suspended 7 of the police officers who were involved in this encounter. And the police chief, a man named Singletary, had announced that he was going to step down. She fired him. The mayor fired him 2 weeks before he was scheduled to step down. Bill, it makes you wonder when you see a situation like this, because it's acknowledged by all parties that that Mr. Prude was on PCP, so he was under the influence of drugs. You wonder whether police, by their very nature, their training, the fact that they're heavily armed, that the fact that they have a particular view of the community and their role in it, are really the best people to handle a situation when you've got a drug addict running naked down the street. You wonder, Bill, whether they should call in people who are experts at drug addiction rather than law enforcement.
Yeah, call a social justice warrior to come over and subdue the guy.
I'm totally serious about this. Why
I know
not
you're totally
call somebody who says,
I know you're totally,
hey, this guy
I know you're
is
totally
not,
serious about
his
this.
main problem isn't that he's a criminal. His main problem is that he's on drugs. So why not bring in health experts, drug experts, people who have mental illness capacity to be able to come in and engage that guy rather than see it as something where you've got to arrest somebody and take him downtown?
The problem is not that he's on drugs, Scott. There are lots of people who are on drugs who get exactly the kind of help you're talking about. There are any number of people who are suffering from delusions or addictions or whatever the case may be, and they're either taken to a hospital or they're given a specialist or rehab specialist or whatever. The problem wasn't that he was on drugs. The problem was that he was on drugs and violent. And when you get to the violent part, now all of a sudden you can't go with somebody who's in a white coat, no matter how well-intentioned the entire idea must be. If you've got somebody who is so strung out on drugs and they are violent and insane with rage, then you have to deal with the police force. And it is becoming impossible to become a police person in this country, policeman, policewoman. It's becoming impossible. There's a conflict of two fundamental forces at work here for people who have a sense of conscience and morality and also a sense of reality. On one hand, you want perfection. You want a police force that is using the minimum amount of force necessary for the minimum amount of time necessary. And you want all of these episodes of excessive use of force, and you want all the bad eggs out of there. That's the first thing I would do. But you want the police to behave in the fashion that an ideal police force should behave in, which is they will use exactly how much force is necessary and not an erg of energy more than that. So that's what everybody wants. It's what everybody of conscience wants from a police force. At the same time, you're dealing with two different reality interventions here. One of them is the reality of not knowing what's happening before it happens, the reality of being out there on the street and having a human being have to make decisions. And that alone puts enough uncertainty into it to start having some cases cross the line. And the second part of reality that you have to acknowledge is that people who are out there doing the job are people. And sometimes they make emotional mistakes. That's not to say that they should be forgiven of an emotional mistake. If somebody spits in the face of a policeman draws a weapon and puts 7 rounds into their head, you could say, well, they were emotionally disturbed about getting spit in the eye about that. Yeah, but that doesn't justify the response. But with that said, you are still dealing with people who are acting in real time with a situation that they do not know the outcome of. And also you're dealing with human beings, with people. And so when you see things like, especially when you find out that George Floyd was walking around saying, I can't breathe before he went down on the ground. And when you've got this guy who's so full of PCPs that he's just walking around and just basically threatening everybody, you have to start asking yourself, okay, in a mature society, a society of adults, a society of citizens and not just hysterical children, you would have to take a look at this and say, do we have an epidemic here? Or do we have, when I say epidemic, is there a systemic failure? Or if we're given the fact that there are probably hundreds of thousands of arrests a day, if not millions, that the times that we see where something like this goes wrong, which in this particular case doesn't sound like, at the very least, it wasn't intentional brutality on the part of the police, then you have to start asking yourself, if you have 350 million people, most of them extremely ornery people, many of them heavily armed, you have to start asking yourself, at what point do you have a failure rate that is as good as you're going to get in the real world? And I don't think we're far from that. It goes back to the Boeing issue too. It's like, okay, Yes, can we improve? I'm sure we can, but we've gotten to the point now where all of these improvements, they're not exponential, they're asymptotic. When things get to a certain level of anything, level of good, level of bad, once they start to get saturated, you have to put more and more and more effort to get less and less and less gain. And if you look at if you count the hits and the misses, if you were to examine every single police arrest in the country over the course of a year, and you had then something to compare we'll just call them problem cases with, then you'd have some perspective on this. But when all you do is highlight these things and inflame them for your own political gain, then you're no longer trying to improve a situation that's already pretty good. Then you are actually in a situation where you're just using the fundamental mechanisms of reality against people for political purposes.
And if you had that data, you might ask, which direction is the trend line moving?
Well, we all know the answer to that question. In 1890 in New York City, if a policeman suspected you of a crime, they'd take you to the police station, they'd beat you up until you told them what they wanted to know. Doesn't happen anymore. They used to kick dogs on the street. You just have a dog run, just run up and kick it just for fun. They used to set cats on fire just to have a good laugh. They used to spit on the sidewalk. Somebody came to the United States, I want to say in 1870 or something, and they were talking about the streets of New York, and they said it was like it was paved with oysters from all of the people just spitting on the streets. We don't do that anymore either. So the question is, it's not a question. You've got these two opposing forces. You've got the appropriate, natural, desirable attempt to reach perfection in terms of perfect flying airplanes, policemen that don't exceed their limits, all of it, all across the board. And at the same time, you've got the stubbornness of reality that says your failure rate used to be 1 in 1,000, then it became 1 in 1,000,000, now it's 1 in 100 million, but you're still failing. And now we're going to make sure that everybody knows about this failure, and we're going to turn it into an epidemic, into a crisis. And this is one of the many felonious acts on the part of the media, whether it's intentional or whether it's just for ratings in terms of the it bleeds, it leads kind of thing. It's not how adults function. It's not how an adult society or a civilization functions. And much more importantly, that it is not how a civilized and sane society can function. This cannot continue. And so it won't.
At BillWhittle.com, we'll provide a link to the New York Times story that provided the source information for this episode, as well as to the episode of Bill Whittle Now that Bill mentioned several times regarding the Boeing 737 MAX that we recorded also this week. The members at BillWhittle.com make all of this possible, and they also produce their own content at a member-written blog, which you're going to really enjoy when you become a member by clicking that big green Become a Member button at BillWhittle.com. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.